Okay, we'll get going. It's always so nice to see these conferences because everyone knows each other, and so it's very hard to break up the conversations, but I'm sorry to do that. You'll be able to continue them over drinks afterwards. Welcome to the final session of our conference today. I'm Armida van Rij, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow and head up the Europe program here at Chatham House. Thanks so much for sticking with us, and I hope that you'll found it a day of very interesting, fruitful, in-depth discussions. Just to remind everyone that we are on the record and we are also being recorded, so just to be clear. So we spent the morning talking very much about Russia's intentions towards Europe and what it's actually trying to achieve, and then we had some very good breakout sessions in terms of security and defense issues, but also the geopolitical tools where we heard about sanctions, enlargement, etc. In this session, we're going to be looking at how Europe should respond to Russia instead. And I think that what we'll probably end up doing is pick up on some of the divisions and kind of issues that were simmering this morning, but didn't quite come out all the way to the fore around the divisions that exist within Europe when it comes to approaching Russia. Some of the challenges, the issues of resilience in Europe, questions around economic warfare and the extent to which that's successful, but also just the overarching strategy and vision. Is there even one strategy or vision towards Russia within Europe? I'm joined by a set of excellent speakers, both in person and online. All the way to the far left is Maria Domanska, who's a senior fellow with the Center for Eastern Studies, OSW, in Warsaw, Poland. In the middle, we've got Christian Lifländer, who's the head of the defense policy section at NATO, joining us from Brussels. To my immediate left, a familiar face for those in the UK, of course, the Right Honourable Ben Wallace, who's a former Secretary of State for Defence of the UK. And then online, we are extremely pleased to be joined by Oleksandr Lytvynenko, who's the head of Ukraine's National Security Council. Thanks so much for joining us. We are going to be diving straight into it, and I'm going to turn over to you, Ben, for you to tell us what you think or how you think Europe should respond to Russia.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. Well, I first of all think we should not lose sight of the fact that we have to be true to ourselves in the West and our values around human rights, freedoms, rule of law, and all the things that we have seen Russia trample over. And I think that's really important because I think the way we deal with Russia has to be the 3 C's, I would call it. So one is we have to coordinate with each other of all the like-minded nations who believe in those values, the European values, but also the transatlantic values. And we must make sure that an international front is what is always presented to Russia, whether before, during, or after this illegal war with Ukraine. Because the one thing I think Putin desperately wants is acceptance in the international community, and he cannot be comfortable relying on both China and North Korea. He just can't be. I mean, if that's as good as you get, North Korea, then that's not the vision he had of his great position in the world. So I think that's really important that we coordinate, and there is strength through coordination. Now we have NATO, we have something very unique with NATO, we have an Article 5, we have a pooling of sovereignty in a way that other international groupings don't really have successfully. The UN Security Council does a lot, but never manages to deliver much on those issues. The EU, of course, the United Kingdom left the EU, but fundamentally, I used to find that the EU was quite slow at getting there, and obviously having to go at the slowest pace of the person, usually Hungary on this issue, at the back. Whereas NATO absolutely is a united front, and throughout the whole of this, we have seen Russia be actually very careful not to slip into attacking a NATO country above the threshold. They know the strength of NATO as an organisation. So first of all, coordinate is important. And then I think calibrate. I was in Berlin last week, and Olaf Scholz is going to present to his people that he's cautious, right? And that's why he's the guy for the job. He wasn't cautious, is my view. He was actually entirely wrong in his handling, and indeed he was hesitant and confused, and in doing so emboldened Putin. Actually, you need to calibrate when you deal with Russia, in my view, which is they do something you work out the response in a language they understand, but also where you are not going to be intimidated. So when we were arming Ukraine throughout the build-up, we made sure that we calibrated our response to their behaviors. So when, for example, they started hitting civilian territory early on, civilian buildings, I said, right, we're going to arm Ukraine with the short-range anti-aircraft missiles, the Starstreak missiles that have been so damaging to Russian helicopters. And I made sure that we always calibrated our response, both in military assistance, but also, I think, in our sanctions, etc. And I think it's really important that the Russian leadership understands why things are done to them, or not, as the case may be. And that's why the last C is communicate. I think it's really important. We just don't do it and let their imagination carry away with themselves that somehow there's a great conspiracy or that there's an MI6 officer behind every single pillar trying to plot the downfall of Russia, which is quite a common theme in Putin's world. And so every time I, for example, put a new weapon system into Ukraine, I would ask the department, we would summon the local GRU resident Hood from the embassy. He's no longer there now. He's on a one-way ticket. He's had to leave, which is a bit of a pity. That's my personal view. I didn't want him expelled because it was really important to communicate. We are doing this today because you did this yesterday. Because you indiscriminately bombed Odessa, we are going to put in Storm Shadow or whatever it was. So they knew. One, they might have disagreed, they might have thought that's the wrong answer, but whatever it was, there was a communication of our position. And I think those three C's are very, very important when it comes to deterrence, and it also comes to dealing with Russia in the long term. And that's why I come back at the end of this to my point about being true to ourselves. Right? We shouldn't be in a position where, because it's the easier thing to do, is to compromise ourselves in dealing with Russia. And if that means there's a big C at the end of this called containment, uncomfortable as that might be, and we just contain Russia and carry on with our lives and leave them to have Christmas parties with North Korea, whatever they want to, then so be it. It's not the perfect response. It's maybe not the way to deal with Russia for those people who think that Russia is something to give the world, but it's going to take us to compromise in order to do something different. And I think the strongest messaging we can globally say is, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is our rule of law, this is our respect of human rights. And I'm afraid that is it. And if you don't want to do that, then off you go and play with whoever, but fundamentally, we're in the business in Europe and continental Europe of doing that. And maybe people will say, oh, you can't make Russia change, Russia's always like that. But I think we just have to be true to ourselves, because that's all we have. That's my book. That's all we have to what we are and why we're better than them in what we stand for. We are better than those people that commit war crimes. We are better. Our soldiers are better than that. Our people are better than that. The Ukrainians are better than that. And therefore, I think we just have to stick to that. And if that means containment, Iron Curtain, whatever you want to call it, which is not the best option, but fundamentally, it's how we maintain our values and our position.
Now, there's lots of things there that I want us to get into, in particular the China and the North Korea angle is one of them, and also this question of what does modern deterrence look like, which Christian can help us with. But just to pick up on the final thing, Ben, and you're no longer in government, so I don't want to hold you to account, but I do just want to push you a little bit on, when you say we have to stay true to who we are, have we done enough for Ukraine and for European security so far?
I think we could all do more. We can do more. There was a badly reported comment by the media of something I said at NATO, where I said Amazon. What they missed out was when I went to Ukraine quite early on in the conflict, and there were casualty rates were getting quite high. I remember going to this meeting with the chief of the staff and all the military commanders there, and I said, look, and we had a sort of 45-minute meeting where I was told about what was going on, and then given a list. And I said, look, we're a partnership, we're not Amazon, right? That is actually what I said. I didn't just say we're not Amazon. I said we are a partnership, because what I had come to Ukraine with was an offer of training. I came to Ukraine with an offer to train thousands of people. We've trained 50,000 now. We would fly them out of Ukraine, brought them to British bases and train them. And I said, look, it's a partnership. if we don't train people to use those weapon systems properly, if we don't train people to have better survival rates, this conflict could go south very quickly. So that's actually what I said. So we could always do more. Some of it, we get too hooked up on totemic individual weapon systems, right? So when we were talking about could we fire Storm Shadow into Russia, I kept trying to say, no. The real pressure should be trying to get Germany to release Taurus within Ukraine, because those are big stocks, right? Yes, we need to be able to strike, going back to being true to ourselves, in accordance with international law. We have a right to support a country who wishes to strike the bases in a country that is prosecuting an illegal war against them. That is international law, right? You're allowed to do it. Ukraine is allowed to strike Russian bases prosecuting the war. International law doesn't let them strike some random base on the far side of Vladivostok, but fundamentally, if that base is prosecuting. So I think it's really important that we don't always end up with the usual cycle of totemic weapon go around in circles. What we need to continue to do is support Ukraine in the mass. Could we have done more? We probably could have all trained more, but we also would ask Ukraine to release more people. Could we have put British soldiers in the west of Ukraine to train people? I think, well, we already did. I was public. We sent medics to help train Lviv, Ukrainians. It didn't get much media, but actually they were military medics, right? Why can't we? We're allowed to. International law. They weren't combat. So we could have maybe done some more training in Ukraine if the Ukrainians had wanted it. But I think, could we have ramped up our productions? Yeah, we all could have done. Europe could have really, the penny should have dropped in Europe that there is a war on in Europe and we need to go to a sort of war footing.
We might come back to that, as well as a partnerships piece with perhaps the rest of the world, which I think is so important to this. But for now, I'd like to turn to Christian. You've heard what Ben had to say, particularly in terms of deterrence. From a NATO perspective, what does modern deterrence look like?
Well, let me start by thanking you for having me here. I think the timing is excellent. What you have is a lot of interesting things happening. Indeed, you have the sort of the incoming US administration, you have the new sort of EU Commission in place, you have UK working on the SDR, trying to sort of formulate its thoughts. You have elections coming up in Germany. So in many ways, I guess what we're looking at is almost like a rendezvous with destiny here, heading our way. I'm also sort of between a rock and a hard place because my boss, Secretary General, will take the floor this Thursday on the 12th to outline his vision for NATO going forward. So the question is, I know what I have to say. Can I make it interesting without sort of stealing his thunder? So let me try my best and just sort of set some pieces on the table. So first, a little bit on the Russian threat, because I think it's important to understand what's at stake. And a lot has been discussed this morning. I'm not going to repeat at least all of it. But I do agree, I mean, when you look at Russia, yes, I mean, its aims are far-reaching, right? I mean, it's looking at not only being a great power, it wants to be arguably a global power. So when you listen to Duncan Allen this morning, I think I completely agree with him. What matters for us, I think, is that the sort of the aims that Russia has are very consequential, right? So it wants to create or restore its sphere of influence and territory in the east, and Ukraine is currently, and I stress the word currently, the center of gravity. So really what's at stake is the European security order and also our values. And military, of course, plays an important part for Russia to project power. And when you look at sort of the war of attrition in Ukraine, and when you listen to the Foreign Minister, Landsbergis, yeah, I mean, the aim is annihilation of a nation in this regard. But here's something as well to bear in mind, that Russia is not omnipotent. Its resources are not unlimited, right? Look at what's happening in Syria. I mean, I agree with Ben here. Indeed, Russia is trying to leverage its partnerships. It's trying to sort of get out of isolation and turn these sort of partnerships into strategic alignments. I think what's also interesting is that Russia is also trying to compensate, right? What you have here is it's trying to use nuclear coercion. I mean, you had Oreshnik, you had the RBMM, and you have the sub-threshold activities. And that's important because I think what I'm seeing is something that that I have come to realize that the absence of war is no longer peace. Right? And that's quite profound, because quite often the laws that we have put in place reflect the time of peace. The acquisition processes we have in place reflect the time of peace. But we're kind of in this place and we're being boiled like a frog. And I think the bad thing here is if we get used to this new normal. In other words, when it comes to escalation management, we kind of go along with that escalation. I think that's bad. We need to resist that. A Russian victory or success will have, I think, an enormous effect on the stability in Europe. First and foremost, of course, breaking with the principle that borders should not be changed by force. But make no mistake, it will also change our way of life, the way we do business, accumulate wealth, live our lives. I guess some of us will have to sort of start learning Russian. So this is what's at stake, and that's why, to me, it's important. So for those of us that are looking at the strategy piece, and I will come to it next, I think there's an important shift that needs to happen. So instead of thinking about security with Russia, as it used to be the paradigm, I think you need to look at how to defend against Russia, and that's something quite different. Not surprisingly, I mean, we stand where we sit. I sit at NATO, so my response to that would be strengthening our deterrence and defense. And here comes the bitter pill. NATO has a key role to play. I think it's an excellent platform. We have risen to the challenge in the past. We can do so also in the future, but I kid you not, this will require significant increases in spending. Well beyond 2%, long-term investments in defense, right? So somebody mentioned this morning that it is a contest of resources, and it is. We need to put money to this thing. In many ways, we almost need to outproduce Russia's reconstitution. You heard Secure talking about the 2-3 year timeline, right? Because that's what it takes for them to reconstitute, and I tend to agree with that. Very specifically, because some of you have been sort of asking about it earlier today, I think we need to focus on how to strengthen land forces, in particular, air defense, strike capabilities, and also modernizing nuclear capabilities, right? But here's the catch: money is not for free, right? So there are going to be some difficult decisions ahead. I mean, usually the choices that you have is, you either raise taxes, you cannibalize other budget lines, or you borrow the money. So these are the difficult decisions ahead. So the challenge, in other words, still remains: be ready to fight tonight against this sort of weakened but risk-prone Russia, that I think still possesses many capabilities that can still hold allies at risk. Okay, we might talk about degradation of conventional land forces, but the air forces are still there, the naval part as well. I would also say that we need to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, and I suspect that the incoming US administration will have a thing or two to say about that, particularly as it sort of focuses on burden sharing. In other words, bottom line here, I think we need to have a more agile deterrence posture. Right? Yes, on one hand, be mindful not to contribute to inadvertent escalation, but also, I think that sort of strikes me that we seem to be deterred by our own fears. Be ready to deny Russia advantages, but also their own initiative. Right? Should be able to create strategic dilemmas for them. Now, when it comes to the sort of the below the threshold space, a couple of quick words. Yes, we do live in an interconnected world. Our economies are intertwined. Yes, Russia continues to meddle and pose dilemmas on us. You see them doing that in the Middle East. You see that in Africa. You have the DPRK angle and what have you. But I would like to also stress that we have also instruments, and we have also sort of ability to play that game. And Russia has vulnerabilities. So I think the key thing here for me would be not to be deterred by our own fear in this regard. So agree with Ben. If I had sort of three sort of elements of that strategy that needs to emerge, that would be to contain Russia, to support Ukraine's fight for independence, and to constrain Russia's ability to wage war, to reconstitute. It's going to sort of take us time, but without doing so, I think we're bound to fail. So in summing up, somebody asked, is it too late earlier this morning? I think it's not too late. I think we can do it. but I would also like to say that we don't have much time. So that time window is not going to be there forever. This is not going to be a cost-free competition. It will entail costs for us. And I would also say that big nations need to lead. Indeed, when I look at the figures, I think when you look at the European nations, I think everybody's able to sort of maneuver and operate at the brigade level. But quite often it's the core and the divisional level, right? When we need big nations to step up. Core and divisional level enablers. And finally, I'd go back to the citizens, right? Because this is going to be this will entail costs. It's not a cost-free sort of competition. I think the citizens will need to understand what's at stake for them, so as to go along with the direction, with the sort of strategic direction that we have set for ourselves.
Thank you very much. There's a lot there that we will need to unpack in more detail, particularly I think the final point on citizens, the trade-offs that are involved, the political trade-offs. But I think that the thing I just want to pick up on now is, you mentioned we need to strengthen the European pillar in NATO. There's been a lot of reports and debates and things about what that looks like. At the same time, and I'm sorry to be asking a NATO official about this, but the EU is stepping into the space increasingly, and I'm kind of taking a leap forward and saying greater EU-NATO cooperation on this is good. EU stepping into the space is good. My question to you is, how can we use the EU funding mechanisms and other mechanisms to strengthen European security as a whole, which therefore also means that the European pillar within NATO is strengthened? What does that look like?
First, they need more money. I can be honest. I mean, that 1.5 billion is just peanuts.
They're floating ideas about 100 billion in the next MFF, but obviously that's a few years away.
Yes, indeed. To be quite honest, I'm quite agnostic as to how this is going to be sort of created, what kind of a borrowing instrument and financial liabilities, how these are going to be sorted out. What I am, I guess, sort of, looking at it from a NATO point of view, is that at the end of the day, we all have a single set of forces, right? I mean, it shouldn't be we shouldn't be creating two separate armies. And I think listening to the new commissioners and the High Representative, I think that's not really the space that they're looking at. I think the focus is still going to be, or quite a lot of it will be, on enablement, on resilience. In other words, on all of the pieces that are still going to be needed, not at the sort of the pointy tip of the spear, but in a sort of enablement and in a support role. I'm quite cognizant that I'm in London and in Chatham House. I think a lot of discussion needs to be had on the EDF, the European Defence Fund, right? And I guess our message here would be that instead of sort of looking at that money being spent to subsidize domestic industry, I think it needs to be spent on capabilities that actually help us, and quite quickly, on the battlefield. That means access also to third parties to the EDF.
Yeah.
That's exactly the kind of answer that you were asking for.
I fully subscribe to that. And that's not just because I sit in London, but because that's just what we need for European security, right? Okay, thank you very much. Turning online to Oleksandr, you've been very patient. Thank you so much. Can you talk to us a little bit about, from where you sit in Kyiv, what the stability in Eastern Europe look like? What does a resolution to this conflict look like?
Hello, thank you for this invitation. I want to start from some small remark. Fortunately, I am a secretary of the NSDC, not a head. It's quite important from understanding the situation. First of all, I want to insist that events of the last decade have turned Europe, especially in its eastern part, in the battleground of fierce struggle. In Ukraine, the war against the Russian aggression, which is bloodiest and the most destructive conflict since the Second World War, has continued for over 1,000 days. Meanwhile, the Eastern Mediterranean faces a series of active conflicts. Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, reflecting tensions between Israel and Iran. The international security system has eroded and fails to fulfill its core function, resolving conflicts in a non-military way. The threat of an uncontrolled escalation with unpredictable consequences is the greatest in decades. The best scenario for European security lies in a stable and effective global order, where European nations play a leading role. As the President of Ukraine stated during a recent briefing with the newly appointed President of European conflict, if the conflict is frozen without any strong position for Ukraine, then Putin will return in 2, 3, 5 years. He will come back and destroy us completely. He will try to annihilate us. Therefore, our goal must be not a temporary truce, but a stable and sustainable peace. When designing peace in Eastern Europe, we should consider the following. First, the war which started as a Russian blitzkrieg to take Kiev in 3 days has now lasted for almost 3 years. Ukraine has resisted, not only Russia itself. In fact, anti-Western network has been already formed and united by a common confrontation with the West. This network includes at least Iran and North Korea. The second one, Russia has very close economic and technological ties with China. You know this better than me. The third, Russian narratives extend beyond its borders, influencing many Western countries, but primarily the states of the global South. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is a part of broader global processes, and we should take into account, and we should understand, but that Ukraine is not just a European question. It's a question of the global security. For over 20 years, Russia has employed hybrid warfare tools in Ukraine. This war started from the hybrid war. Nowadays, such tools become increasingly evident in the EU and NATO countries. And it's not only propaganda and disinformation, and many people think. It's also about economic and energy pressure, cyber threats, intelligence operations, the use of corruption for political and security purposes, leveraging criminal networks and shadow schemes. Acts of sabotage and subversion have also become numerous cases. That's why sustainable peace requires not just the end of hostilities, but also the termination of hybrid warfare, or at least the development of effective and coordinated countermeasures which will deter Russia in this sphere. Fourth, in the 33 years since the USSR collapse, Russia has failed to resolve any conflict or promote lasting stability in any country. Instead, it consistently exported instability, shaped wars and conflicts in neighboring states and other regions such as Middle East and Africa. The case of Syria, which happened a few days ago, is a strong proof that Russia can destabilize but can't stabilize. And it's determined Russian constraints and Russian limits. Fifth, Donald Trump's convincing victory in the US presidential election reflects a strong demand of American people for change, both domestically and foreign policy. There are many consequences of this event, but one of the most important for us is that European nations should take a bigger role, bigger impact on the situation and including security sphere. Six, the existence of the security gray zone is traditionally viewed by Russia not as a threat, but an innovation to act. Holy place is never empty. Russians strongly remember this phrase. Ukraine must be integrated in the Western economic and security system, becoming not merely pro-Western, but a fully Western state. We strongly understand that we should transform those things, but Ukraine should become a Western state. And last but not least, the time is limited. We are in a critical phase of struggle. Its results will determine directly how safe the future world will be. It's critical not to lose this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your point about Russia exporting instability is exactly what we're seeing in Europe as well, right? Through all the grey zone warfare, but also through its support for far-right parties across Europe, which we won't get into this particular session, but there's a lot there. I just want to follow up on, you mentioned that the war in Ukraine, or Russia's war in Ukraine, sorry, I should say, started with Russia's hybrid actions. Ukraine has been feeling this for over a decade now, perhaps probably longer than that. And as Russia is ramping up that kind of grey zone warfare on Europe as well, I just wonder what some of the lessons are that we can learn from Ukraine in terms of mitigating, in terms of resilience, but also in terms of perhaps responding to some of this type of warfare.
Thank you for this question. I want to think one thing. We should understand that us fight by hybrid threats and react immediately and tough. All soft and slow response create just field for further Russian actions. It should be very active, even proactive and tough response and decisive. We should be very decisive in this issue.
Thank you. And I think a good example for that actually is when Russia weaponized migration and staged the surge of migrants on the border with Finland, and Finland immediately closed the border very decisively. Lots of legal discussions afterwards, but still very quick, swift decision. Thank you very much. Finally, last but certainly not least, Maria. You've heard the panel so far. You've heard all of the discussions this morning. What do we do?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you for having me here. I totally agree with the razor-sharp diagnosis and a lot of solutions offered by speakers during the day. And it's true we have a gigantic collective GDP and lots of advanced technologies and 500 million people and things like that. But what the West is lacking dramatically is, I would say, cognitive resilience. I mean, the Western mental maps and also myths and stereotypes about Russia that the West has embraced make the West vulnerable and put the entire global security order at risk. What to do? First, we should creatively adapt to Russian strategic culture, which is totally different from Western strategic culture. And many politicians and experts also still tend not to understand it or underestimate it. We should raise the cost of Russian aggressive foreign policy, and we should try to influence Moscow's calculations. Create strategic dilemmas and ambiguities for the adversary, yes, and also present it with fait accompli to narrow Russia's scope for reflexive control vis-à-vis the EU and NATO. And I would say that Ukraine NATO membership would be one of those fait accompli. I mean, if Russia sees that there is no room for maneuver, for blackmail, and for trying to prevent certain developments, I'm pretty sure they will at certain point stop this blackmailing. What we tend to underestimate in the West is that Russia has weaponized the language. Still too many people fall for the Russian manipulation. I mean, when Russia uses the word negotiations, we still tend to put into this term the content that we usually understand behind this term. When Russia speaks about its security interest and so on, we tend to project our understanding of these words, but Russia actually signals totally different intentions. And also, what I would like to underline is that Russia understands war in a very particular way. I mean, war for Russia is an all-encompassing endeavor, and I would say that the military force is used during the very last phase of the whole war process. I mean, Russia is perfectly aware of the relative weakness of its army. So Russia historically has tended to introduce the army as a factor only at the stage when In Russia's eyes, the ground had been prepared for this stage. And I'm pretty sure that Russia attacked Ukraine in 2022 precisely because Putin was pretty sure that the ground had been already prepared by the FSB, for example, in Ukraine to welcome the Russian army with flowers, which wasn't true. And this is a bit about whether Russia is ready to attack NATO or not. Not as long as Russia is pretty sure that Article 5 will be activated. But if Russia sees or perceives NATO as a weak alliance, not ready to activate the Article 5 in the case of, for example, a minor military incursion into the Baltic states, there can be a strong temptation to test the ground. So what if Russia miscalculates again? What if Russia again expects that we wouldn't react? They might take this step, unfortunately. A second thing that is needed to be done, we should decolonize Western mental maps and the perception of the Eastern Europe. The traditional Russia first policy, Russia first because Russia is big, because Russia is nuclear, should be replaced by prioritizing relations with other smaller states, first of all with Ukraine, that can offer a peaceful, stable and win-win cooperation. Then we should delegitimize Putin's regime. We keep legitimizing him after decades of doing so. Just to give you some examples, why Western companies are still operating in Russia after almost 3 years of this war. Why are we still buying Russian oil, feeding its military with our Western money? What was Lavrov doing at the OSCE meeting, and what is Russia doing in OSCE after 3 years of this war? I would say it's in the West's strategic interest to bring about Putin's departure from power, which could open a window of opportunity for political change. Putin is not anymore a legitimate president because he ran unconstitutionally in the last election, and he's an internationally wanted criminal. Let's delegitimize him also in the eyes of the Russian elite and nomenclatura. We need to compromise and discredit his imperial project, prove other belligerent leaders that war is counterproductive as a tool of foreign policy. Otherwise, future Russian governments will again try to build their legitimacy on stoking revanchist sentiment. How to discredit the imperial project? Obviously, Russia's defeat in Ukraine and a deep economic crisis inside Russia due to Western sanctions, but also due to the fact that the Russian government still chooses to invest in guns, and at a certain point it will drastically limit the investments into butter, so the basic social needs of the population. We should be open to the idea of political change in Russia as a path to lasting peace in Europe. The West has fetishized the idea of Russia's stability. And, I'm Polish, so I assume I'm allowed to be hawkish. But from our historical experience, it's quite obvious that every time in our history, when Russia was too weak or too unstable to meddle into its neighbors' affairs, the world was safer. Its neighbors were safer. They could be sovereign, fully sovereign. And also the position of the West in the international order would be much stronger. So people fear Russia's destabilization, although this super stable Russia has produced the biggest threat in Europe since 1945. I don't believe in Russia's democratization. Maybe in some decades, maybe. But what is an achievable goal, to the best of my understanding of the situation, is the minimum level of pluralism in Russia and a minimum level of scrutiny of the Kremlin's actions and decisions from other groups of influence. We should support all kinds of democratic groups inside and outside Russia, civil society, political opposition, and independent journalism in a systemic and long-term way. Regardless of who comes to power after Putin, a normalization of Western relations with Russia should be conditional not only on Moscow abandoning its aggressive foreign policy and paying compensation for war crimes, but also on political liberalization inside Russia. So zero tolerance toward human rights violations, because growing repression was actually a prelude to foreign aggression. I often hear a question from my colleague experts: what if someone worse than Putin comes to power after Putin? I would say that Putin is a leading imperialist and leading nationalist and a war criminal who effectively controls the nomenclatura, the society, and the resources inside the country, and who has made himself personally hostage to this war. So I can't imagine anyone worse, but let's assume that someone worse pops up. This person will be much weaker than Putin, I mean, automatically, before this person consolidates his or her, probably his, power. And we can prevent it. So again, what I would envisage is rather some kind of a pluralism by default and maybe some kind of fierce infighting in Russia, but again, at least they would not attack their neighbors. So we could see some minimum level of scrutiny from other pyramids of power. Also, the nuclear argument is often raised. I mean, what about the safety of Russia's nuclear arsenal? The same arguments were presented in 1991, and we sort of managed to sort it out. So I would also point to my expectation the new Russian leadership would be vitally interested in gaining some kind of international legitimacy, and nuclear factor will be crucial in that. There is also, as regards the possible Russia's collapse or disintegration because of the demise of this over-centralized authoritarian power after Putin, I would say that I don't see any premises to expect a collapse of the Russian state, because Russia is much more resilient than in 1991 to all kinds of these developments. But what we need is the future federalization, decentralization, and decolonization of Russia. And actually, among the society, the idea of local self-governance is quite popular. My last point, we often ask a question, what kind of Russia are we likely to see in a decade or so? I would strongly suggest reformulating this question, what kind of Russia we want to see, and what are we ready to do in order to at least try to achieve this goal, because we tend to forget that we, the West, have actual agency. And we can have impact not only on Russia's foreign policy, but also, although mostly indirectly, on Russia's domestic developments. This, of course, would be extremely difficult to pursue this kind of proactive policy, but I think this is perfectly doable. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I paused there for a second because there's a lot, especially your final part, there's a lot there, and I hesitate a little bit because know thy audience, but I guess we don't have the best record of regime change, to put it mildly. And I'm not saying that that's what you are suggesting, but I am just a little bit cautious. Someone here at a meeting, and I think it was on the stage, and I think it was on the record, but it was either Tim Ash or Keir Giles, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I think what they said was, on the record, was that Putin is a product of the regime, which is a slightly different argument from what comes after Putin is perhaps worse and we don't know. But do you, bearing in mind those things, do you still see that as the way forward?
The regime change.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because I don't think that we ever really seriously tried to do it in Russia. I mean, the policy of the 90s was, I would say, quite erratic and not very consistent. And actually, back then, we started to feed authoritarian tendencies in Russia. But usually when we use this term regime change, we, especially the Americans, think about Iraq, for example, right? So I'm not talking about this kind of regime change, definitely. I mean, no foreign intervention, no foreign occupation. I mean, no, I'm not saying this, and please bear it in mind. But I think that we lost a lot of opportunities to actually impact the Russian leaders in the past. It's an open question to what extent we can actually force them to do something or not to do something. My point is that we have never actually tried, because there was this kind of enthusiasm, euphoria that, oh my God, Russia is changing, Russia will be different, so let's invest heavily in Russia without paying too much attention to things like human rights and what this actual Western engagement is perceived by society back then and afterwards. So I think we should be cautious in the future and not try to legitimize another authoritarian leadership. It's a matter, for example, of recognizing them. I mean, okay, we can recognize you or not, based on certain conditions met or not. So this is like a huge topic. And I'm not pretending, to offer like the only correct solutions, but I see another problem that no one is actually ready to discuss it, because we are sort of paralyzed in front of Russia, like a mouse in front of a cobra, and we are afraid of even thinking about some kind of political turmoil in Russia, and I don't quite get it, and I would love to see a proper debate, public or non-public, it doesn't matter.
Great, thank you very much. I'll come to the audience in a second, but before I do that, I just want to pick up on what some of you have alluded to, which is the partnerships piece. And part of that is about who we in Europe have as international partners beyond NATO and the EU. Part of that is also who Russia has as partners. We know about China, we know about North Korea, we don't talk enough about India, we don't talk enough about Iran. So on the one hand, and perhaps Ben, I'll just start with you on this because you would have seen this up close, but on the one hand, should we be seeking a strategy to drive a wedge between Russia and China and all those kinds of issues? But on the second hand, how can we make the case to some of these countries better for supporting Ukraine in its efforts?
I think rather than saying a wedge, I would say wherever Russia is active in its sub-threshold or its corruption or its division around the world, we should make sure it costs them, right? So when Wagner is rampant on West Africa, we don't just run away or leave it to them. And there was a big debate, I remember, in France and Mali about, do you leave and they let Wagner run Mali, which whatever their new body is called now is sort of running it. Whether, in Syria, causing them a dimension, the point made earlier, Russia is finite. It has finite resources. It does have a finite population. It does have, I suspect, even though the media and everything else is entirely controlled, it has a tipping point amongst its population. So I think we make sure that they are never given a free ride, whatever they want to do. So whether it is Novichok, nerve agent in Salisbury, whether it's murders in Berlin or attempted murders in Austria or Czech Republic, sabotage, or whether it is the daily attacks on cyber or the use of organized crime proxies to burn down a warehouse in London in May, you have a response. You never let them off. And it costs them. Because the other thing we have in our favor, as well as our alliances, is wealth. I mean, let's not forget, Russia's economy is less than half of Britain's, right? Okay, that is a staggering failure on governance since the Cold War. Staggering. It's not enriched itself. It's enriched its individuals. It's enriched Dubai. It seems to be enriching Cyprus and enriching Israel, but it's not enriching Russia. So we have money and wealth and educated people and science and technology on our side. So we can cost Russia wherever it wants to behave if we want to, right? And so I think that's the first thing we do. And eventually they will run out. I mean, one of the lessons of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union could simply not maintain its military in the Warsaw Pact. It just ran out of money. It couldn't. And as we saw when the wall came down, there were rusting ships, submarines couldn't go to sea. They couldn't maintain that military posture, which costs a lot for everybody. It's expensive and it's exhausting. So I think that is the best way. We also need to remember our old lessons. So soft power is as important as hard power. And one of the things we've done in the West is we have tied ourselves up with so many rules on our own foreign aid, on our own educational support, because that would look wrong, that we are being outcompeted by people who completely cheat, don't care about the rules, come along and pay off every African dictator and get the mineral rights and everything else. And we're there going, well, we're not going to link trade and aid, we're not going to link aid and assistance. So we have lost the art of soft power. Our foreign offices, I'm afraid, have stopped being able to play chess and have become very two-dimensional, rather than thinking 2-3 steps ahead, which we used to be good at. So I think we need to invest. When we talk about defence spending, I always included in my rows with the Chancellor, we need to increase our money for our intelligence services and for our soft power. And I'm afraid I'm not in the place of regime change. I think we do have to remember behind all this is a horrendous tragedy, right? Tragedy for the Ukrainian people, where Ukraine never posed a threat to Russia at all. But Putin chooses to invade and murder and kill thousands of people. He also chose, out of his vanity or aggression, to murder effectively his own people in the hundreds of thousands of Russians who didn't have a choice. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of widows and mothers and brothers in Mother Russia, as he'd call it, who have lost somebody they love. Right? Now, I am not in the forgiving mood of Russia. I would put myself in the Hawk camp. But this tragedy is inflicted by Putin. He is most frightened of information. That's what we don't have to regime change. We have to fight every day to get true information, free press into Russia. Wherever they are, challenge them. Sitting in the UN, challenge them. In our embassies here, challenge them. Wherever they go about, in the south, what do we call it, where they've been successful in Africa, rewriting the rules and rewriting propaganda.
Which I think is what Maria was suggesting, is kind of supporting civil society. And, yeah.
In the end, that's what we have to hope for, because of all those tragic, deaths. And I'm not sticking up for them, but they have relatives, they have people, they have relations, and we have to get information into Russia. And it's very hard, but it can be done. But we just have to cost them wherever they behave. They've just lost a port on the Mediterranean. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Another strategic success by Putin. He has been a fantastic strategic leader. He's actually lost at many levels, really lost. And I think people shouldn't forget that, right? We shouldn't gloat, but he has fundamentally lost. He's got Sweden and Finland on his borders now in NATO. They were deeply neutral. He has just lost his Mediterranean port in Syria, which he uses to refuel his ships to go to Africa. He's actually lost, and we must make sure he loses in Ukraine as the final pillar.
On that, I want to come to questions, because I know that there are lots. I'm going to start with James, who organises this conference. So those of you who are saying thank you, all thanks to James and his team in particular.
It's not me, it's my team colleagues. But thank you, Amira. James Nixie, Chatham House. So I do have a question for Sabine, if I may. First of all, let me say thank you for the support you've shown, the unswerving support for Ukraine over the past 3 years. Very appreciative on behalf of my Ukrainian colleagues, in fact. But could I just pick you up on one thing you said at the start of your remarks? That you beseeched us not to get hooked up on individual totemic weapon systems. And I guess my question is, why not? I mean, aren't they useful for Ukraine's war effort in helping to save Ukrainian lives, in helping Ukraine to prevail over Russia? That's my question. Thanks.
I'm actually going to take 2 questions at a time because I want to maximize them. So second row, yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm William Horsley. I used to report for the BBC out of Germany and continental Europe. I'd like to ask the panel to address 2 difficult questions which I don't think have been answered today. One is about the political will of countries like Germany, but also an increasing number of countries like-minded, who have effectively, the strategic decision is not to agree with the rest of Europe to come to a war footing, not to adopt the advice from many people at this conference that if Europe delays, they're only delaying war that will come to them. So, and if you look at the speeches of Merkel about her book and also Chancellor Scholz, they prioritize the well-being of the German population in terms of living standards and jobs and not confronting Russia. So the first one is, can we possibly make progress unless we get a change of political will of that kind? And the second related question is, what can we do in the next few weeks before Donald Trump comes back to office to get help Europe to seize an initiative or not at least not be steamrolled by Donald Trump?
The $1 million question. Where should we start? Shall I perhaps start with you,
Sure.
Christian? Yeah.
Let me start with the second one. Yeah, increase your defense spending. I mean, that would be my.
Yes, but even when countries increase their defense spending, it still takes time for that to actually have an impact, right?
Yes.
So what do we do in the short term?
Indeed. I think it's actually, I mean, let me go back to what Ben said, because that's worth exploring. So sometimes it's not only the question of money, it's also the question of just absorbing that money, right? Of just being able to spend it. And I think, I mean, let me sort of go back to sort of my point about sort of absence of war is no longer peace, right? I mean, I think what I'm sometimes worried about is the speed of legislation. And some of the things that are sort of legacy issues were for us, I will be quite honest, if like you have to go to a parliament in order to spend this or that every other week, I mean, you're just gridlock. You're not able to make any difference. So I think part of it is about resources, part of it is about money. I think that's going to be a very clear ask for Europe to step up. But I think it needs to go together with the ability, improved ability to process that money and spending that on the capabilities that matter. So that's why I said it's not a cost-free endeavor that's ahead. I mean, pick your poison, I guess, is the sort of as we proceed down that line. And when it comes to political will, well, I mean, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte will try sort of his best this week, sort of outline, you know, basically laying out the case of what's ahead and what do these choices mean. I think for some this is going to be perhaps more difficult than for others. When you look at the sort of countries that are bordering Russia, forgive me for saying this, but you know, if you're staring down the barrel of a Kalashnikov, it focuses the mind. So I think it's perhaps sort of other parts of the continent that have a different risk posture in this regard. And it is quite possible that sort of countries will wake up at different speeds. I still take that rather than not sort of waking up at all, because once again, to me, it's only 2-3 years that we have, and unless progress is made, I think we're in trouble. I'm also quite pragmatic when it comes to sort of different platforms of how to actually move the needle, right? To me, I mean, quite often when you look at how things happen at the international arena, it's almost like a strategic onion. The further, you know, you peel, the more you cry. It depends on sort of how you look at it. There are things that can and should happen at 32 when it comes to NATO and the multilateral. There are things that perhaps are best done in coalitions, and there are things that are best done either bilaterally or unilaterally. I think the question is the sort of the art of the possible and sort of picking the platforms in order to move that needle.
Rita.
Yeah, thanks. Just very briefly on that. I think it's another false dilemma that we have created, a false dilemma between security and prosperity. I mean, it goes together, or we don't see any of it. So I think, very brutally speaking, it's much cheaper for us, NATO, to defeat Russia in Ukraine than to try to defeat Russia on our own territory. I feel I haven't been precise enough as regards the mechanism of the regime change. So I wasn't suggesting sending, a brigade of Marines to Moscow to topple Putin. Of course, Russia's future is in Russians' hands, but we can create a space for them to have this possibility to at least give it a try, or we can close this space. So my bottom line was that in the 90s and afterwards, we rather assisted the regime and not society. And when I talked, and I talk quite regularly with my Russian colleagues from democratic circles, they say, listen, this regime have kept tightening the course and kept making the repressions harsher and harsher. And Russian society still was watching how the West was supporting this regime through decades. So we help Russians in the future post-Putin to do something positive, good with their country, or not. If not, the only strategy is an endless deterrence, for decades maybe. It doesn't mean isolation of society and democratic groups, but just, very costly deterrence for decades.
Oleksandr or Ben, I wonder if you want to come back on James's initial question.
Does Alexander want to?
Do you want to come in, Oleksandr?
The totemic weapons.
If I may, thank you for raising this question. I want to make just one remark. I think the best strategy to change Russia is strengthening Ukraine, to invest in Ukraine defense, and the best soft power to Russia should be fortified by its hard power. Ukrainian air defense, munitions, artillery, tanks, etc. It's the best way to persuade Russians that their behavior is better. The best way, Russians strongly understand the language of power, and we should persuade and help them to understand their mistakes. By artillery, by air defense, by missiles. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come in?
Look, the thing about the totemic, it's an on balance, right? So on balance, from a Ukrainian point of view, pushing a single weapon system creates the point of I'm still here, right? Don't forget us, we're still here, demonstrate your support. But on the other side, I think the totemic debate did more damage than good because it exposed Western splits. It showed a weakness on that international unified front. And it also suggested to the public that it was a magic weapon that it would all be over with. And, it doesn't matter how many Storm Shadows we gave, and we don't have a limited supply. The most effective weapon has been shells, the 155 shell and the 172 shell, I think it was, on the battlefield. And that is what Ukrainians cry out for, is barrels and 155 shells more than any other. And my point was, there's always two ways to skin a cat, right? There is always, right? So if you can't get from the Germans, Taurus, the Ukrainians have been incredibly successful and resourceful at developing their own weapon systems at longer ranges, where we should be helping with money or technology or whatever we need to do if we can't get Germany over the line with Taurus, right? Or whatever's the next weapon system. Fundamentally, there are more than two ways to skin a cat. Ukraine sank the Moskova, the Russian flagship, the first flagship to be sunk, not the second one, the first one, with their own missile, the Neptune missile, right? They did it. They didn't wait for the best Western anti-ship missile, they did it. So my point about the totemic is there's a danger that the public go in the West, are you still here? Didn't we give you a tank? Didn't we give you a missile? And it sets the wrong space and it allows the Germans and the Hungarians and all the other rows that go on to split the coalition. And actually, there are definitely allies who support Ukraine who just get on and do it, right? I remember Olaf Scholz thought I had deliberately undermined his tank policy. I didn't ask anyone. I just said, how many spare Challengers have we got? And we just sent them. We didn't do a dinner, we just did it, right? And I think that's the way to do it. And there are plenty of military powers who have capabilities. No one's mentioned Turkey here, right? Ignore Turkey's rhetoric. Turkey has been supporting and arming the Ukrainians all the way through this, right? They call it aid, international aid, but they've never stopped, right? They've been supportive from the beginning, and they provided some weapon systems that we're still debating in the West probably now. So I think my point is, on balance, I understand why President Zelensky does it, but I also think that the disruption it can cause and the effect. The ultimate way we're going to help Ukraine win is fund them properly, help fund them, supply them with technology, supply them with many 155 shells, supply them with training, and never stop helping Ukraine militarily with equipment, advice, people, whatever you need to do to get and defeat Putin. And that's the best way to spend your defense money right now, is spend it in Ukraine.
Thank you. Oleksandr Goncharenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. And my question is, we have the topic of our meeting, this conference, this session is Europe's strategy towards Russia. And what is in general Europe's strategy towards security? I really don't know. If to look at the deeds, not at the wording, it's just count on American military might and on Ukrainian willingness to die, protecting European borders. It's a very bad strategy, not just from moral point of view, but from practical point of view. Because what will Europe do when the United States will decide to stop deliver security to Europe, maybe in 1 month, and when Ukrainians will finish, will end. And we're moving to this. Just during this conference, once again attack on Zaporizhia in Ukraine, a medical center, 2 people killed, dozens wounded, dozens people under rubble, including lady ophthalmologist friend of my family. And that's happening right now. So my question is, and my address is, 3 years ago, in December 2021, when Americans and Brits knew what will happen next, Europeans did not believe. If it would be not just Ben Wallace, one man in Europe, sending weapons to Ukraine at this exactly time, but 30 Ben Wallaces did this, that would be a completely different situation now. And if Europeans would say at that time, I am ending, would say at that time, we will send the troops to Ukraine, Putin will never invade. Now it's time to do this. It's not enough, Mr. Wallace, to fund, to supply. Unfortunately, it's not enough anymore. We need boots on the ground. You need to send troops to Ukraine, not onto the trenches, but at least for training, for auxiliary missions, to protect Belarusian Ukrainian border, and by this to free Ukrainian forces and so on. That's time to make this. Please. My question is very simple.
Okay,
it's time to send boots on the ground. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Thank you. Here in the front. Please keep your hand up.
Thank you. My name is Emily Prey. I'm from the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. My question is about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. We've been having a lot of conversations today on defense, security, conflict resolution, but I haven't heard anything about women's voices and the WPS agenda. Just very briefly, Women, Peace, and Security is a UN Security Council. It's based on a series of UN Security Council resolutions that address women's inequitable experiences pre, during, and post-conflict. And the data backs up the agenda as an effective tool that when women are more involved in peace processes, that peace is 35% more likely to last for 15 years. And yeah, so the question is, can you talk about the importance of engaging in WPS at the Ministry of Defense, at NATO, elsewhere, and how this can be a way to push forward liberal democratic values and the rule of law that you mentioned earlier? Thank you.
Great. Boots on the ground.
If you read my Telegraph column about 3 months ago, I called for 3 things that I think could help bolster, win the war in Ukraine? First of all, the West should consider putting non-combatant boots on the ground, right? Logistics, people who could service the tanks, who could train people. We could do, I mean, you know, because you're Ukrainian, the scale of your country is so vast. We could put boots on the ground in a role that could help do everything from service tanks and aircraft to help with technology. We could do that. Secondly, and I do think this is important, in 1939, Britain mobilized men. In 1941, the Women at War Act, we mobilized women, right? Because we faced an enemy that wanted to annihilate us. You faced the same. The easiest ask that Ukraine can make of the West is training, right? No rows about whether it's a Taurus or a Storm Shadow. If President Zelensky mobilized in the same way we did in 1939 and asked the West to train 1 million Ukrainians in a year, and then they went home and they put their helmet under their bed and they put their uniform in and they went back to work, the West could do that. That's a very strong, powerful message to Putin about the depth of the resilience of the Ukrainian forces and people. And yes, I know that's a worry for President Zelensky about the economy and trying to balance the future, etc. And I understand those debates. But we had that debate as well. We spent 58% of our GDP on defense fighting the Second World War, right? Because we were surviving, and I know you are as well. So in the column, I said boots on the ground. I said we should continue to do that, but I also said that if we want to send a message to Putin about your, the depth of your resilience, we can help. All those 30 countries in NATO, we could train 1 million. It's not, we did 50,000 alone in Britain, and actually it's the easiest give we can give.
On women, maybe I will try to handle it. Well, I think that feminist policy in general, because it's usually presented feminist foreign policy, but feminist policy maybe is a broader term, would be a very good alternative to this authoritarian, violent political culture based on toxic masculinity that we have witnessed in Putin's Russia. But the problem is that feminist policy is too often equated with pacifism, which doesn't work in this case. And in Poland, we have some otherwise brilliant, magnificent feminist activists who regularly repeat that war is bad, peace is good, so let's engage in negotiations. And frankly, I'm not following too closely all this debate, but my impression is that this female voice is not as vocal as it could be, for many reasons, perhaps. But I think that this is a good direction to think about future solutions for Russia. And actually, I would like to point to Russian anti-war feminist initiatives and organizations like Anti-War Feminist Resistance and others. And of course, this female voice in Russia is being heavily suppressed. But if we listen to the arguments and to the ideas presented by anti-war female activists in Russia, this is also something that deserves our attention. And my impression is that what we are lacking is to combine voices within the UN and other international organizations and the voices of Belarusian, Ukrainian, Russian, other female activists to present a viable alternative to this toxic authoritarian culture. Probably I haven't answered your question precisely, but I think that this is something that this kind of reflection is dramatically lacking in the public debate.
Question?
Let me tell you a story. It actually happened. I cannot name names, but because it deals with an intelligence agency in one of the Allied nations. So they recruit people by newspaper advertisement. And it's a puzzle. If you solve the puzzle, it will lead you to the next puzzle. So overall, you have to go through 5 puzzles. And in the end, it gives you the phone number, right? And you call the phone number and there's a recruiter on the other side. True story. It just happened once that the recruiter picked up the phone And there was a young girl, 14 years old, that said that I had just hacked your phone. It's going to turn off in 15 seconds. Right? So some of it, I think we have to pursue sort of indeed the women, peace and security agenda. But I think a lot of it is also sort of putting on a hat of a strategic competitor and looking at how can we harness that potential that we have, and how can we do so in a really, really smart way. Well, in that particular case, they couldn't hire her. So they had to wait until she was, an adult, and then the contract was signed, etc. But I think there are a lot of opportunities there, where once again, kind of like what we had discussed this morning, I think we need to be more imaginative in this regard of how do we harness the positive sides, the society that we have. I don't really see that Russians will be doing that, by the way. So that's why I think a big part of it is also sort of, trying to reimagine things a little bit differently. Yes, it's going to be a 14-year-old girl that has hacked your phone, and that's the new world.
And perhaps the thing that makes me think, the thing that we haven't really talked about yet is, Finland's approach to this, or Sweden's approach to this in terms of comprehensive security, total defense, whatever you may want to call it, which is far better at actually responding and being resilient to Russia's grey zone warfare. Who knows, there might be a question on that. There was a hand at the back, blue jumper.
Tamara,
sorry, if I can ask you to keep your questions brief, just because we're starting to run out of time.
Yeah. Reporter for James, Tamara. My question is specifically for Oleksandr Lytvynenko, the head of Ukraine's National Security Council. We've seen a rapid growth of drone tech as well as electronic warfare jamming on the battlefields of Ukraine. There was a recent story about GPS spoofing, Ukraine sending Russian Shahed drones back into Russia. What can you tell us about lessons for the European defense industry from these developments?
Yeah, great, thank you. And then question here in the middle.
Thank you. Tony Brenton, former British diplomat. I'm going to say something which is not going to go down very well with this audience, but given the slightly one-sided nature of the debate here so far, I think it needs to be said. This war has now been running for getting on for 3 years. The front line has not moved in effect for the last 18 months, and with winter coming, it's not likely to move for at least another 8. The casualties are happening at the rate of about 50,000 a month. Carnage also continues in every other sort of way. Okay. The obvious question, but the question which apparently only Donald Trump has thought to ask is, should we not be looking for a way of ending this? I'm sure we've heard lots of stuff here about how we've got the weapons, we've got the political unity, all of that, we can go ahead and win. I'm sure exactly the same discussions are taking place in Moscow.
Right.
So, as I repeat, it seems to me we should be looking for a negotiated end.
Thank you.
And I invite the response of the panel to that thought.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to take one more here at the front.
Thank you very much. Robert Walter, former Member of Parliament, and I've been sanctioned by Russia since the annexation of Crimea, so that's nearly 10 years. But my question is picking up on a couple of points that Ben and Christian made. Ben talked about containment, which does follow on from Tony Brenton's point, and the Cold War. He used the term Cold War, but on our terms. And Christian talked about money, increasing money, and our terms means Ukrainian sovereignty. My question is containment, long-term containment, can lead to taxpayer fatigue. How can governments, politicians, and others, civil society organizations, win the hearts and minds of the people for that defense spending, which is essential? And I just remind you that during the latter years of the Cold War, the UK spent 5% of GDP on defense, and Maria may remind us that Poland next year will spend nearly that on their defense.
Thank you very much. Oleksandr, I'm going to start with you with the very directed question at you on drones and drone technology.
Thank you so much for this question. First of all, I am again insist, I am secretary, not a head. Really, it's important. But about drones, maybe it's the one of the most quick development sphere. Drones, as well as radio electronic warfare, very quick development, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia, and both sides of the war heavily invest in this situation. What lessons from these points for Europe? To be proactive, to invest in R&D, to invest in production, and to understand that the war is changing. The new technology is a huge benefit, it's a huge privilege. Who rule by new technologies, this side wins. Very simple lesson.
Thank you. How does a war end in containment? Maria, shall I maybe start with you, just given the last question?
About
Poland.
containment?
Well, whichever, both.
Well, frankly, I don't remember many numbers apart from this famous 4.7 GDP on defense in general. What is funny is that a couple of weeks ago we got information that the European Commission started excess deficit procedure against Poland because we are going to exceed our budget deficit set by the European Union. So this is really like astonishing because this also reflects this lack of imagination and understanding of the situation, that we have to switch from the peace mode to the war mode. I'm not a security expert, so I can just I can share with you I would say nationwide a popular understanding of how Russia should be contained that prevails in Poland. It doesn't have much to do with the official government policy, but if you ask is like an average poll about Russia, usually people will say something like, okay, just let's keep Russia as far as possible from us. And we wouldn't be against like a collapse of Russia because the world would be much better then. And to quote a joke I recently heard, I love Russia so much that I would like to see a couple of Russias existing. So this is about containment. My point is that I think that in Poland there is quite fertile ground for this kind of discourse. I mean, containment, deterrence, investing heavily in defense and things like that. And also to like properly present the state of debate about Ukraine in Poland, it is also, I think, important because there is a lot of false beliefs about it. I think that even though there are some disputes and some kind of a war or Ukraine fatigue in Poland for many reasons, we don't have time here to explain it in detail. The one thing is sure, in Poland there is broad understanding that Ukraine is fighting for our strategic interests too. So even if there is some Ukraine fatigue in Poland, it doesn't mean that we change our stance vis-a-vis Russia and the overall strategic interest. This was very low-level, not expert statement, but I think it's important also to understand the cultural background.
Nonetheless, very helpful. Christian.
Yeah, how to end it and containment. I mean, in some ways, I mean, we're always going through these election cycles. I mean, and so there's going to be that sort of pressure on the system. But I tell you, I mean, and you will hear from NATO Secretary General later this week. I mean, even if we sort of look at the an increased level for sort of NATO allocated capability targets, we're still like really well below from where we were in the Cold War. So it's not at that level yet. But I think a key part here is going to be educating the voters. and sort of making clear what the cost of failure when it comes to deterrence is, and that can be much, much higher in this regard. But I think that's going to be with us for quite some time. And when it comes to sort of how to end it, I guess the question here is going to be at one point, like whether you take the bad deal over no deal at all. In other words, I mean, how do you negotiate? And my advice would be to negotiate from the position of strength, rather than to have a weak hand and to have the sort of a dismal negotiation in this regard. So in some ways, this is about short-term security interest, but I think in many ways this is also about the long-term security interest. And I guess the challenge for us in the West is going to be how do we not compromise the long-term security interests over the sort of the short-term interests that are going to be quite pressing, I think, all over the place.
Look, Tony, it's very interesting that people aren't there saying we want war, we want everyone to die, right? But the choice of what happens to Ukraine is for the people of Ukraine to make. It is not, don't shake your head, that it's not for us to tell them. And if we are seen to tell Ukraine to settle on something they're unhappy with, Putin will know that he can do it somewhere else, and the big powers will come along and tell that little country to do as it's told. So whatever they do, Britain will support Ukraine's choice. But it must be their choice. It cannot be our definition of success or victory. It cannot be France's definition. It has to be the sovereign choice of Ukraine, because it is that country that has sacrificed its people in defending itself. It is not for me to say what that should be. We will stand by to support them in that decision and the aftermath of any negotiated peace. But it isn't for us, because Putin would love to see a world where the big states dictate, against international law often, to states that are always got a bit inconvenient now, where can you just shut up and go away? We're not going to do that. We should help Ukraine get to the best position it wants to. We should offer alternatives if they are determined to carry on. But it is up to Ukraine. It's absolute. This is what we're for. This is why we're here. It's about the resilience of the West to stand up for our values and international law and help them come to that decision. Now, if Ukraine believes that it's important, so important that it continues to fight and lose at that level, right? Who am I to tell them to stop it, right? It is for the people of Ukraine to have that choice and take that choice. And in the meantime, we must also recognize that the world is much less safe than it used to be, much more anxious than it used to be. And Robert's point is the first thing we can do is discuss with our own populations and prepare about why we need to spend money on resilience, why we might have to cut other budgets to spend it on defense or security or foreign policy or foreign. When I was a child of the 70s and 80s, there was a healthy debate about nuclear disarmament. Everyone knew about what NATO was. NATO was a nuclear alliance. It comes as a massive surprise to lots of members of the current population in Europe that NATO is a nuclear alliance. I mean, when Holland and Germany buys aeroplanes in line with NATO policy, it's because those airplanes have to be able to, if necessary, take nuclear weapons, right? That's a complete surprise to lots of population. It wasn't in our day. It was a healthy debate. County councils had bunkers. We built resilience into our system to survive. It was just perfectly normal. We had, world is more complex, a much more complex infrastructure and critical infrastructure than it used to be. But, we've sold them all off. Some very enterprising young men bought the Wiltshire one, made it into a cannabis farm. And we're growing floors of cannabis. They're all in prison now. But ultimately, we've got to have that conversation about resilience in the way that the Scandinavians have never stopped having that discussion and understanding about why they have reserves and all of those sort of things. So we have to, first of all, start with that conversation, and our politicians have to stop pretending there's something for nothing, right? The Treasury tricks that are used to inflate the defence budget are staggering, and it's a NATO thing, so please, can you stop this? I didn't like it. That you can count VAT receipts in your defence spending, right? 1.6 billion pounds of Britain's defence budget is a VAT receipt, right? It's a complete fraud. No one buys it. The enemy doesn't buy it, right? You can't kill anyone with a VAT receipt, right? And it goes back to the Treasury. And the spending rules allow us to artificially inflate our defence spending that convinces no one at all. And so we need to change that and be honest. And when we say we're going to spend 2.5 or 3%, we say it because we say, and we're going to cut transport, or we're going to cut whatever you want to cut to pay for it. We're not going to pretend there's a magical supply of civil servants that are somehow going to pay for everything. We just cut them all, which is nonsense. So I think we have to be grown up and honest in our debate, but we have to broaden defence to include foreign policy, foreign office, and intelligence services. It can't just be hard metal.
And aid.
And aid. Same thing.
I think we'll need to continue the conversation of resilience over drinks. Oleksandr wants to come back in, and then Maria will have the final word, and then we head upstairs to continue. Oleksandr.
Thank you so much. I want to add for brilliant words of Mr. Wallace, just one thing. Ukraine is very interesting in peace, but I just repeat my quotation of Zelensky. If the conflict is frozen without any strong position for Ukraine, then Putin will return in 2, 3, 5 years. We need a strong position. And without your assistance, without our common position, it's impossible. Just all.
Yep. No, very helpful. Maria?
Yeah, I totally agree with the need of Ukraine's sovereign choice in everything that concerns its future. The problem is that probably all European politicians would verbally subscribe to what you've said, including Olaf Scholz. The problem is that as regards deeds, we have been dramatically shrinking Ukraine's room for maneuver as for its sovereign choice. So it's a blatant hypocrisy, and this is one of the problems, I think, leading problems. Just as a concluding remark, I would suggest thinking out of the box, because the time when we could just stick to well-known procedures is gone. And we need some imagination. I think it's a very the word of this conference, like imagination. We need more imagination, but also more like brave thinking. And we need leadership. And it would be a disaster if it turns out that we need another big war, like the Second World War, after which we had an excellent leadership in Europe. It would be a disaster if it turns out that we need another war to wake up and find some leaders. And leaders, as the very term suggests, are supposed to lead and not to follow every single survey of public opinion. So I think this is another advice I would give to European politicians.
Thank you very much. I am now literally the only thing standing between you and a drink. So thank you so much for coming. I encourage you to continue all of these conversations upstairs. Thanks so much to the whole Russia and Eurasia team for putting this on with the support of our Chatham House Conferences colleagues, of course. Thank you.